August 25th, 1944. The roads of northern France stretched endlessly under a merciless summer sun, choked with dust and diesel fumes as hundreds of supply trucks rolled eastward in an unbroken chain. Sergeant James "Jimmy" Dawson, of the 397th Quartermaster Truck Company, believed this would be just another grueling 16-hour shift, hauling ammunition and gasoline to the front lines. He had no idea that before sunset, his unorthodox driving skills learned on the dirt roads of rural Alabama would transform him from an anonymous driver into a legend whispered about in mess halls across the European theater. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What began as a routine supply run would become a desperate race against time, where one man's creativity and courage would prevent a disaster that could have crippled the Allied advance toward Germany. The Red Ball Express represented one of the most ambitious logistical operations in military history. Named after the Red Bull symbols that marked priority freight trains in civilian railroads, this massive truck convoy system was established to sustain the rapid Allied advance following the breakout from Normandy. Between August 25th and November 16th, 1944, approximately 6,000 trucks operated around the clock, moving over 12,000 tons of supplies daily across more than 400 miles of French countryside. The operation employed roughly 23,000 soldiers, with nearly 75% of them being African-American drivers, loaders, and mechanics from segregated quartermaster units. Jimmy Dawson had grown up in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, where his father operated a small hauling business serving the rural farming communities outside town. From age 12, Jimmy had learned to drive anything with wheels, often backing heavy farm trucks through narrow barn doors and reversing trailers down winding dirt paths when there was no room to turn around. His father used to say that any fool could drive forward, but it took real skill to drive backward with precision. Jimmy never imagined those lessons would matter beyond the red clay roads of home, but the military had its own plans. He enlisted in 1942, joining thousands of black Americans who saw military service as both patriotic duty and potential pathway to better opportunities. The reality proved more complicated. Segregation followed them across the Atlantic. Black soldiers were predominantly assigned to service and supply units rather than combat roles, regardless of their qualifications or desires. The Quartermaster Corps became the primary destination for African-American troops, where they performed the unglamorous but absolutely critical work of keeping armies fed, fueled, and armed. The 397th Quartermaster Truck Company arrived in France in July 1944, just weeks after the initial invasion. Their commanding officer, Captain Robert Henderson, was a white West Point graduate from Connecticut who initially harbored the typical prejudices of the era. His executive officer, First Lieutenant Marcus Cole, was one of the rare black commissioned officers in the Quartermaster Corps, a Howard University graduate whose dignified bearing and meticulous competence slowly earned Henderson's grudging respect. The company consisted of 48 GMC CCKW trucks, universally known as Jimmy trucks, or deuce-and-a-halfs, for their 2.5-ton cargo capacity. These six-wheel drive vehicles formed the backbone of American military logistics, capable of traversing terrible roads while carrying up to 10,000 pounds of supplies. Each truck measured approximately 23 feet long and could reach speeds of 45 miles per hour on good roads, though convoy speeds rarely exceeded 30 miles per hour due to the endless stream of traffic and deteriorating road conditions. By late August, the Allied advance had created a logistics nightmare. General George Patton's Third Army was racing eastward, covering distances in days that planners had expected to take weeks. The port facilities at Cherbourg struggled to handle the volume of incoming supplies, while the destruction of French rail infrastructure forced almost total reliance on truck transport. The Red Ball Express emerged as the desperate solution, requisitioning every available truck and driver for continuous operations along dedicated one-way routes stretching from Normandy beaches to forward supply depots near the front lines. Jimmy Dawson had completed 17 round trips by August 25th, each journey a test of endurance and nerves. The outbound runs carried gasoline, ammunition, rations and equipment. Return trips brought back empty drums, damaged vehicles, and occasionally wounded soldiers. The drivers operated on minimal sleep, fueled by bitter coffee and the knowledge that every delay might cost lives at the front. Maintenance was performed on the move, with mechanics riding along to handle repairs during brief rest stops. On this particular morning, Jimmy's truck was loaded with 120 jerry cans of aviation gasoline, each containing 5 gallons of highly volatile fuel intended for fighter aircraft supporting the ground advance. The cargo weighed approximately 5,000 pounds and represented a massive fireball waiting for an excuse to ignite. Convoy regulations strictly prohibited smoking, required minimum spacing between vehicles, and mandated that drivers avoid sudden stops or harsh maneuvers. Everyone understood that a single spark could transform the entire convoy into an inferno. The convoy departed at 0400 hours, 41 trucks moving in darkness, through the shattered remains of French villages still bearing fresh scars from recent fighting. Jimmy occupied position 17 in the column, maintaining exactly 50 yards distance from the truck ahead. His assistant driver, Private First Class Thomas Little Tommy Wright from Chicago, rode in the passenger seat, responsible for watching for obstacles, monitoring the truck behind them, and keeping Jimmy alert during the long hours of monotonous driving. Little Tommy was 19 years old, rail-thin, and blessed with inexhaustible optimism that somehow survived the grinding reality of military service. He carried a worn photograph of his mother and 3 sisters, which he'd show to anyone who'd look, proudly explaining his plan to use his military pay to help them move out of their cramped Southside apartment. Jimmy found the kids' enthusiasm simultaneously endearing and exhausting, but Tommy's sharp eyes and quick reactions made him an excellent assistant driver. The convoy rolled through the morning without incident, navigating the main supply route that had been designated Red Ball Express exclusive territory. French civilians watched from doorways and fields, their expressions mixing gratitude, exhaustion, and hunger. Some waved. Others simply stared at the endless stream of American vehicles carrying the material weight of modern warfare toward the front. Jimmy wondered what they thought of the black faces driving most of these trucks, whether they found it ironic that men denied full citizenship in their own country were delivering liberation to Europe. Around 1100 hours, the convoy approached a critical choke point near the town of Dreux, approximately 50 miles west of Paris. The main route funneled through a narrow stone bridge spanning a small river, then immediately climbed a steep hill with tight switchback turns carved into a wooded hillside. Traffic control MPs at the bridge base regulated flow, allowing only 5 trucks onto the bridge at a time to prevent overloading the ancient structure. Lieutenant Cole was riding in the lead truck that day, coordinating movement with the MPs and other convoys sharing the route. The system worked smoothly until approximately 11:30 hours, when a mechanical failure transformed routine operation into potential catastrophe. A truck from another unit experienced complete brake failure while descending the hill on the far side. The driver, unable to stop on the steep grade, steered into a massive oak tree at the roadside rather than risk plowing into vehicles ahead. The collision knocked the tree across the road, creating an impassable obstacle that blocked the entire route. The timing couldn't have been worse. 5 trucks from Jimmy's convoy had already crossed the bridge and were climbing the hill, unable to proceed past the blocked switchback. The remaining 36 trucks, including Jimmy's gasoline-laden vehicle, were strung out along the approach road to the bridge, stopped bumper to bumper in the summer heat. The road behind them was rapidly filling with additional convoys arriving at the choke point, creating a traffic jam that stretched back more than 3 miles. Lieutenant Cole quickly assessed the situation. The fallen tree was too large to move without heavy equipment, which would take hours to arrive in position. The narrow road offered no room for trucks to turn around, with steep embankments and dense forest on both sides. The only alternatives were to wait for clearance, which might take 6 to 8 hours, or to reverse the entire convoy back down the approach road to a wider area where vehicles could turn and find an alternate route. Reversing a single truck is straightforward. Reversing 41 fully loaded supply trucks in a coordinated column through 3 miles of winding road with multiple blind curves and variable spacing, while other traffic tries to navigate around them, represented a logistical nightmare that most officers wouldn't even attempt. But Lieutenant Cole understood the stakes. General Patton's advance was consuming thousands of gallons of fuel daily. Every hour of delay multiplied across dozens of stranded convoys could bring the entire offensive to a sputtering halt. He made the decision. The convoy would reverse to the last intersection, approximately 3.2 miles back, where a wider crossroads would allow trucks to turn around and take a secondary route that added 25 miles to the journey, but bypassed the blocked hill. He radioed Captain Henderson at the company headquarters, explaining the plan. Henderson's response was skeptical but ultimately supportive. If Cole thought it could be done, he had authorization to try. But Henderson made clear that if the convoy got tangled up, or if any trucks went off the road, it would be Cole's responsibility. Lieutenant Cole walked down the stopped convoy, gathering the drivers for a briefing. His boots kicked up dust as he moved between the idle trucks, their engines still running, heat waves shimmering above their hoods. The drivers climbed down and assembled in the middle of the road, wiping sweat and stretching cramped muscles. They represented a cross-section of Black America, men from farms and factories, from big cities and small towns, united by the circumstances that had channeled them into this segregated supply unit. Cole explained the situation with characteristic precision. The road was blocked. They needed to reverse to the crossroads 3 miles back. Each driver would need to maintain control while moving backward through curves they'd just navigated forward. Spacing would be critical, no more than 20 yards between vehicles to keep the column compact, but enough distance to avoid collisions if someone braked suddenly. They'd proceed slowly, no more than 5 miles per hour, with assistant drivers hanging out to provide guidance and watch for obstacles. The drivers exchanged nervous glances. Backing up a heavy truck for 100 yards was challenging. 3 miles seemed impossible, especially with the knowledge that their cargo could turn any collision into a fatal inferno. Several men voiced concerns about their ability to maintain control over such distance. One driver flatly stated he'd never reversed more than a few hundred feet in his life and wasn't confident he could manage this without putting his truck in a ditch. That's when Jimmy Dawson spoke up. His voice was quiet, but carried clearly in the hot stillness. He said he'd been backing trucks through tight spots since he was 12 years old. He'd once reversed his daddy's loaded trailer 3/4 of a mile down a winding farm road because there was no other way to reach the pickup point. If the lieutenant needed someone to lead the reverse convoy, to set the pace and show it could be done, Jimmy would take point position at the rear of the column. Lieutenant Cole studied Jimmy for a long moment. He'd noticed Dawson before, one of the steadier drivers who never complained and always got his truck through regardless of conditions. Cole made a quick decision. He restructured the convoy order. Jimmy would become the lead vehicle for the reverse movement, with everyone else following his pace and technique. The lieutenant would ride with Jimmy to coordinate, while the other officers would position themselves at intervals along the column to relay signals and prevent bunching. They repositioned the trucks, carefully maneuvering in the limited space to reverse their order. Jimmy's gasoline-laden truck moved to what had been the rear of the convoy, which would now become the front during the reverse movement. Little Tommy hung out the passenger door, face suddenly serious as the weight of responsibility settled on them. Other drivers watched Jimmy with a mixture of hope and skepticism, wondering if this Alabama farm boy really knew what he was doing or if they were about to witness a spectacular disaster. Lieutenant Cole climbed into the cab, sitting on the engine cover between the two seats. He'd rarely ridden with enlisted men, and certainly never in the middle of such an irregular operation. The experience gave him a new perspective on the cramped, uncomfortable conditions these men endured for 16-hour shifts. The cab was stifling, smelling of diesel, sweat, and hot metal. The engine's vibration rattled everything, yet Dawson and Wright seemed completely comfortable, moving with practiced efficiency as they prepared for the challenging reverse drive ahead. Jimmy explained his technique as he adjusted his mirrors. The key to long-distance backward driving was patience and rhythm. You didn't fight the truck or force it. You made gentle corrections, staying ahead of drift rather than reacting after the truck started going wrong. You used all your mirrors constantly, cross-checking your position against both sides of the road. You trusted your assistant driver completely, following their hand signals without hesitation, and you never, ever rushed. At 1200 hours, Jimmy shifted into reverse, checked his mirrors one final time and began backing away from the blocked intersection. The heavily loaded truck moved slowly, its 6 wheels finding purchase on the dusty road surface. Little Tommy leaned far out the window, one hand on the door frame, calling out steady corrections. Clear on the right. Drifting left, come back 6 inches. Good. Hold that line. Curve coming up. Easy does it. The first 100 yards went smoothly. Jimmy's hands made tiny adjustments to the steering wheel, his eyes constantly shifting between mirrors and the view through the rear window. The truck responded to his touch like a well-trained horse, moving backward with surprising precision. Lieutenant Cole said nothing, watching Dawson work with growing respect for the skill involved. Behind Jimmy's truck, the rest of the convoy began their reverse movement, each driver focused intensely on maintaining position and avoiding the truck ahead. Some drivers were natural at backward driving, their trucks tracking straight and true. Others struggled, weaving slightly as they overcompensated for drift. The officers positioned along the column relayed hand signals, helping drivers maintain spacing and alignment. The first curve presented the real test. A gentle left-hand bend that had seemed insignificant when driving forward became a significant challenge in reverse. Jimmy approached it carefully, starting his turn early, steering right to make the truck's rear end swing left. He held the curve beautifully, the truck arcing through the bend without approaching either ditch. Little Tommy called encouragement, his earlier nervousness replaced by growing confidence in his driver's ability. One by one, the trucks behind Jimmy navigated the same curve with varying degrees of success. Most made it through cleanly. A few required multiple corrections, their back ends swinging too far before drivers compensated. But everyone made it through without incident, and the convoy continued its backward march down the road. They'd covered approximately half a mile when the first real problem emerged. 3 trucks back from Jimmy, a driver named Corporal Edward Fast Eddie Johnson, got distracted for just a moment, looking ahead instead of behind. His truck drifted right, the rear wheels dropping onto the soft shoulder. Fast Eddie corrected hard, but the loaded truck's momentum carried it further right. The rear wheels slipped down the embankment, and the truck tilted at a dangerous angle, stuck with its right side nearly 2 feet lower than its left. The convoy halted immediately. Lieutenant Cole jumped from Jimmy's cab and ran back to assess the damage. Fast Eddie was shaken but unhurt, though his truck was thoroughly stuck, listing at nearly 20 degrees and unable to move under its own power. The cargo, 4,000 pounds of ammunition crates, had shifted to the right side, making the tilt even worse. There was no way to pull the truck out without a wrecker, which would take hours to arrive. But here's where the rigid structure of military logistics created unexpected flexibility. Because Jimmy had successfully proven that the convoy could reverse effectively, Lieutenant Cole made another quick decision. They'd leave Fast Eddie's truck where it sat with 2 men to guard it, continue the reverse movement with the remaining trucks, and send a recovery team back once they reached the crossroads. Fast Eddie protested, embarrassed at being left behind, but Cole was firm. The mission came first. The truck would be recovered later. The convoy resumed movement, now reduced to 40 trucks, still following Jimmy's steady backward progress. They navigated 2 more curves, crossed a small wooden bridge that creaked alarmingly under the weight, and passed through a section where overhanging trees created a tunnel of dappled shade. Jimmy's concentration never wavered, his focus absolute as he guided his explosive cargo backward through terrain he'd seen only once, hours earlier, while driving in the opposite direction. Around 1300 hours, they encountered a complication that nearly derailed the entire operation. A convoy from another unit, unaware of the reverse movement, came barreling up the road toward them. The lead driver was a white sergeant from a transportation corps company, and his face showed utter confusion when he encountered 40 trucks backing toward him down a road they should have been traveling forward. Traffic came to a complete halt. Lieutenant Cole ran forward to meet the approaching convoy's officer, a transportation corps captain who was initially incredulous at what Cole was attempting. The captain argued it was impossible, dangerous, and violated every reasonable traffic regulation. Cole countered that the road ahead was blocked, There was no alternative route at that point, and they were more than halfway to the crossroads where they could turn around. The two officers faced off in the middle of the dusty road, voices rising as frustration mounted. Jimmy climbed down from his cab and walked forward, with little Tommy following. He approached the two officers respectfully, waiting for a break in their argument. Lieutenant Cole noticed him and asked what Dawson needed. Jimmy apologized for the interruption, but suggested that if the Transportation Corps convoy pulled their trucks as far right as possible, Jimmy could guide his truck past them on the left, even while continuing to move backward. The road was just wide enough, maybe with 6 inches clearance on each side. The Transportation Corps captain looked at Jimmy like he'd suggested driving to the moon. The idea was absurd. There wasn't enough room. Even if there was, no driver could maintain that kind of precision while backing up. It would take one small mistake to either scrape the passing trucks or drop off the road into the ditch. The captain started to dismiss Jimmy's suggestion, but Lieutenant Cole cut him off. He'd watched Dawson handle that truck for the last hour and a half. If Jimmy said he could do it, Cole believed him. The Transportation Corps convoy pulled right, their truck's right-side wheels within inches of the ditch. Jimmy returned to his cab, studied the gap that had been created, and nodded to himself. Little Tommy looked nervous but said nothing as Jimmy shifted back into reverse. Lieutenant Cole stood in the road ahead of Jimmy's truck, in position to see both sides and guide him through. What happened next became the stuff of legend, retold and embellished in dozens of versions over the following months. Jimmy Dawson backed his gasoline-laden truck through a gap that measured less than 8 feet wide, with barely 3 inches clearance on each side, while traveling backward at approximately 3 miles per hour. His steering corrections were almost imperceptible, tiny movements that kept the truck perfectly centered in the narrow channel. Little Tommy called distances, his voice steady despite the tension. 6 inches on your left, 4 inches right. Dead center, keep coming. The truck moved backward past the entire 12-vehicle Transportation Corps convoy, never touching anything, never wavering from the center line. Jimmy's face showed intense concentration, but no fear. His hands relaxed on the wheel, making corrections through feel as much as vision. Lieutenant Cole walked backward ahead of the truck, marveling at the display of precision driving he was witnessing. When Jimmy's truck finally cleared the last vehicle in the stationary convoy, the Transportation Corps drivers burst into spontaneous applause. Several jumped from their cabs to get a better look at the driver, who just accomplished what they'd considered impossible. The Transportation Corps captain approached Lieutenant Cole, shook his hand, and admitted he'd never seen anything like that in 20 years of military service. He said he'd move his convoy into a field entrance a quarter-mile back and wait there until Cole's trucks had passed, rather than risk slowing them down further. With the obstacle cleared, Jimmy continued leading the reverse convoy toward the crossroads. The remaining trucks followed his path, though the gap past the Transportation Corps vehicles was widened slightly as they pulled even further right, giving everyone more margin for error. Still, several drivers had tense moments squeezing through, and everyone breathed easier once clear. They were less than half a mile from the crossroads when disaster nearly struck from an unexpected direction. A P-47 fighter aircraft, returning to base with mechanical problems, made an emergency landing on the road directly in front of the reversing convoy. The pilot had no choice, his engines sputtering and smoking, and he brought the aircraft down on what he thought was a clear road section. He didn't know that 40 trucks loaded with fuel and ammunition were backing toward him until he climbed from the cockpit and saw Jimmy's truck reversing around the final curve, less than 200 yards away. The pilot, a lieutenant named Jack Morrison from Texas, stood in the middle of the road frantically waving his arms. Jimmy saw him, stopped immediately, and the entire convoy halted. Lieutenant Cole ran forward to assess this latest complication. Morrison explained that his aircraft couldn't be moved. Its landing gear had partially collapsed during the rough landing. He'd already radioed for recovery crews, but they wouldn't arrive for at least 2 hours. Once again, Lieutenant Cole faced an impossible situation. They were so close to the crossroads. Just a quarter-mile remained. But a 7-ton fighter aircraft now blocked the road completely, and there was absolutely no room to maneuver around it. The aircraft's wingspan exceeded the road width by several feet on each side, making passage impossible. After everything they'd accomplished, the convoy appeared stopped just short of their goal. Jimmy studied the situation, then asked Lieutenant Cole and Lieutenant Morrison a question. How much did that aircraft weigh exactly? Morrison said approximately 7,000 pounds empty, though it still had some fuel aboard, probably pushing total weight to 7,500 pounds. Jimmy nodded slowly, then asked how many men were in the convoy. Cole counted quickly. 40 trucks, 2 men per truck, plus the officers. 85 men total. Jimmy's plan was audacious. If they could position 40 men on each side of the aircraft, and if everyone lifted at exactly the same moment, they could pick the aircraft up and carry it off the road. Just move it 10 feet to the right, far enough that trucks could squeeze past on the left. Morrison was skeptical, but admitted it might be theoretically possible. The aircraft was designed to be relatively light for its size. If the weight was distributed across 80 men, each person would be lifting less than 100 pounds. The trick would be coordinating the lift. Lieutenant Cole assembled the convoy's drivers and assistant drivers, explaining the plan. Some men looked dubious, but most were game to try anything that would get them moving again. They'd come this far through Jimmy Dawson's skill and determination. If he thought they could lift an aircraft, they'd give it their best effort. They positioned themselves along both sides of the P-47, finding handholds on the wings, fuselage and landing gear struts. Jimmy supervised the arrangement, making sure weight was evenly distributed and everyone had secure footing. Lieutenant Morrison checked that nothing would be damaged by the lifting points they'd chosen. Lieutenant Cole counted down from 3. On his mark, 85 men heaved upward in unison. The aircraft rose 6 inches off the ground, wobbling slightly as they fought for balance. Someone yelled encouragement. They shuffled sideways, taking tiny synchronized steps, carrying 7,500 pounds of aircraft through sheer coordinated effort. After approximately 30 seconds that felt like hours, they'd moved the fighter far enough right that trucks could pass. On Cole's signal, they lowered it carefully back to the ground. Lieutenant Morrison stood speechless, staring at his relocated aircraft. He finally found words, thanking them profusely and saying he'd make sure his squadron heard about this. These men had probably saved his aircraft from being scrapped as a total loss. Cole dismissed the thanks politely, got everyone back to their trucks and ordered resumption of the reverse movement. The final quarter-mile passed without further incident. The convoy backed into the crossroads, where a wide area allowed trucks to finally turn around. Drivers maneuvered their vehicles through 3-point turns, getting pointed in the proper direction at last. The entire operation had taken nearly 3 hours, but they'd successfully reversed more than 3 miles of loaded supply trucks through difficult terrain without losing a single vehicle beyond Fast Eddie's stuck truck, which would be recovered later. Captain Henderson arrived at the crossroads in his jeep as the last trucks were turning around. He'd driven up to check on Cole's progress, half expecting to find a chaotic mess of stuck vehicles. Instead, he found an orderly convoy preparing to resume forward movement along the alternate route. Cole briefed him on everything that had happened, giving particular credit to Sergeant Dawson's skill and leadership. Henderson asked to meet Dawson personally. Jimmy was checking his truck's tires when Captain Henderson approached. He straightened and saluted, uncertain why the company commander wanted to speak with him. Henderson returned the salute, then did something unusual. He extended his hand for a handshake, treating Jimmy as an equal rather than a subordinate. Henderson said he'd heard about the backward driving, the precision pass by the other convoy, and the quick thinking on multiple problems. He said Dawson had shown exactly the kind of initiative and skill the military needed, regardless of what uniform someone wore or what color their skin was. It was a small moment, one handshake between 2 men in the middle of war-torn France. But for Jimmy Dawson, who'd grown up in segregated Alabama and served in a segregated military, being recognized and respected for his abilities by a white officer from West Point represented something significant. Not equality yet, not full acceptance, but acknowledgement that competence transcended the artificial barriers society had constructed. The convoy departed the crossroads at 1500 hours, following the alternate route that added 25 miles to their journey. They reached the forward supply depot at 2200 hours, off schedule but successful in delivering every ounce of cargo they'd been assigned to haul. The depot quartermaster logged them in, noting the delay but marking the mission as completed satisfactorily. What happened next surprised everyone. Word of the backward-driving convoy spread through the military logistics network with remarkable speed. The Transportation Corps captain who'd witnessed Jimmy's precision driving wrote a commendation report. Lieutenant Morrison submitted his own account of the convoy lifting his aircraft. Lieutenant Cole wrote a detailed after-action report praising Dawson's leadership and skill. These reports made their way up through channels, crossing desks of officers who were increasingly aware that black soldiers in service units were performing far beyond the low expectations society had set for them. Jimmy received the Bronze Star Medal 3 weeks later, a recognition rarely given for non-combat actions. The citation praised his exceptional skill in successfully leading a reverse convoy movement that prevented critical supply delays to advancing forces. More importantly, he received a promotion to Staff Sergeant and was designated as the 397th Quartermaster Truck Company's driver training instructor, responsible for teaching other drivers advanced techniques. The recognition extended beyond Jimmy personally. The entire Red Ball Express operation gained increasing visibility as reporters and military officials recognized the crucial role these segregated black units played in sustaining the Allied advance. While full equality remained decades away, the unquestionable competence demonstrated daily by thousands of black soldiers in the unglamorous work of military logistics helped chip away at the edifice of discrimination. Lieutenant Cole received a promotion to captain and eventually commanded his own company. His experience working with soldiers like Dawson influenced his post-war advocacy for military integration, adding his voice to the officers who argued that segregation weakened military effectiveness by wasting talent and creating artificial barriers to unit cohesion. Captain Henderson returned to civilian life after the war with changed perspectives. He never became a crusader for civil rights, but he did become one of many northern white veterans who questioned the racial assumptions they'd grown up accepting. His brief handshake with Jimmy Dawson in a French crossroads represented his personal acknowledgement that skin color had nothing to do with ability or character. Little Tommy Wright survived the war, returned to Chicago, and used his military benefits to attend college, becoming a teacher in Southside schools. He kept in touch with Jimmy for decades, their wartime partnership evolving into lifelong friendship. Tommy loved telling students about the time he rode with the man who backed a truck 3 miles through French countryside while carrying enough gasoline to blow them all to pieces. Fast Eddie Johnson never lived down getting his truck stuck during the reverse convoy, but he took the teasing good-naturedly and remained one of the 397th's most reliable drivers. His truck was recovered the same day by maintenance crews who had it back in service within 48 hours. The Red Ball Express continued operations until November 16, 1944, when improving rail service and the Allied advance slowing, due to supply constraints, made the truck convoy system less critical. During its 83 days of operation, the Express delivered more than 412,000 tons of supplies, moved more than 100,000 vehicles, and logged more than 100 million ton-miles of cargo movement. The operation required continuous 24-hour driving by exhausted men on terrible roads, with minimal sleep and constant danger from accidents, mechanical failures, and occasional enemy action. The success of the Red Ball Express represented a triumph of American industrial capacity, logistics planning, and the determination of thousands of drivers who kept the trucks rolling regardless of obstacles. The statistics tell part of the story. The approximately 75% black composition of Red Ball Express drivers represented more than just numbers. It reflected the systematic channeling of African American soldiers into service roles based on racist assumptions about their capabilities. Yet these men transformed the limitation into demonstration. They proved that skill, dedication, and intelligence had nothing to do with pigmentation. They showed that given equipment and opportunity, black Americans could perform as well as anyone. Jimmy Dawson's backward-driving exploit became legendary within the Quartermaster Corps, embellished and retold until some versions had him backing through entire German convoys or reversing all the way from Paris to the coast. The reality needed no embellishment. What Jimmy accomplished that August day required extraordinary skill, nerves, and leadership. He'd taken an impossible situation and found a solution that others couldn't imagine. Then he'd completed that solution flawlessly, under intense pressure, while carrying cargo that could have caused disaster for everyone nearby if he'd made a single serious mistake. The technique Jimmy demonstrated spread through the Red Ball Express drivers, becoming an acknowledged skill set that improved operational flexibility. Other convoys found themselves trapped by road obstacles or traffic jams, and other skilled drivers used extended reverse movements to extract themselves. The military logistics establishment recognized that reverse driving proficiency needed to be part of driver training, a lesson that carried forward into post-war military operations. After the war, Jimmy returned to Alabama, resumed working in his father's hauling business, and eventually took it over when his father retired. He applied military discipline and the organizational skills he'd learned to transform the small operation into a successful regional freight company. He navigated the dangerous years of the civil rights movement, facing discrimination, but also finding that his military service and business success gave him a measure of respect and protection that many black Southerners lacked. He rarely talked about his wartime experiences to people outside the veteran community. The recognition he'd received felt like an anomaly in a society that returned to enforcing strict segregation after the war ended. But other veterans understood. The men who'd served in the Red Ball Express and other black units knew what they'd accomplished. They'd kept the Allied armies supplied through the critical months of 1944. They'd proven themselves in the most demanding logistics operation in history. And they'd done it while facing discrimination from the very military they served with such distinction. The broader historical significance took decades to be properly recognized. Early histories of World War II logistics mentioned the Red Ball Express in passing, often without acknowledging the racial composition of the units or the significance of black soldiers performing so capably in a military system that officially doubted their abilities. Only as the civil rights movement forced Americans to confront their racial history did the fuller story begin emerging. Historians started interviewing Red Ball Express veterans, documenting their experiences and recognizing their contributions. Jimmy Dawson gave one significant interview in 1986 when he was 65 years old, and a local historian was documenting black veterans' experiences. Jimmy spoke carefully, weighing his words, aware that his story represented more than personal memory. He talked about the backward driving convoy, but he talked more about the daily grind of driving 16 hours, the exhaustion, the constant danger, and the pride he felt in doing difficult work well. He mentioned the Bronze Star, but said his real reward was knowing he'd helped win the war, same as any other soldier. The interview captured something essential about the World War II generation of black veterans. They'd served a country that discriminated against them, fought for freedoms they couldn't fully enjoy at home, and performed with excellence in conditions designed to limit them. They didn't expect gratitude or special recognition. They'd done their duty, but they also knew their service had mattered, had demonstrated truths that racist ideology denied, and had laid groundwork for the civil rights advances that followed. Lieutenant Morrison, the fighter pilot whose aircraft the convoy lifted, crossed paths with Jimmy one more time. In 1973, Morrison was a retired colonel attending a military logistics conference in Atlanta. He recognized Jimmy's name in a list of World War II quartermaster veterans being honored at the conference and made a point of finding him. The two men spent an evening reminiscing, filling in gaps in their memories of that chaotic day in France nearly 30 years earlier. Morrison had become a civil aviation executive after the war and admitted that his experiences with the Red Ball Express convoy had profoundly influenced his views on integration and equality. He said watching 85 men work together so perfectly to move his aircraft had shown him what was possible when people focused on mission instead of prejudice. The story of Jimmy Dawson's reverse convoy earned permanent place in military logistics training through an unexpected route. In the 1990s, an Army logistics instructor researching historical examples of creative problem-solving discovered Lieutenant Cole's after-action report in archived files. The instructor developed a case study examining the leadership and technical decisions involved in the reverse convoy movement. That case study entered the curriculum at Army logistics schools, teaching new generations of officers about flexibility, risk assessment, and trusting subordinate expertise. Thousands of modern logistics officers have analyzed Jimmy Dawson's solution to the blocked road without necessarily knowing his race or the segregated context he operated within. The military's integration, achieved through President Truman's Executive Order 9801 in 1948, was still years away that August afternoon in France. But Jimmy's competence and Cole's willingness to trust it represented the kind of practical meritocracy that would eventually make integration not just morally necessary, but operationally obvious. The practical challenges facing the Red Ball Express extended far beyond the dramatic moments like Jimmy's reverse convoy. Every single day presented new obstacles that required creativity and determination. Trucks broke down constantly under the strain of carrying overweight loads across damaged roads. Tires wore out at alarming rates, with some trucks requiring new tires every 500 miles. Engines overheated in the summer heat, especially when climbing hills with maximum loads. Brakes failed from constant use on winding roads. Fuel consumption exceeded estimates, sometimes leaving drivers stranded miles from supply points. The maintenance crews, also predominantly black soldiers from segregated quartermaster units, performed miracles keeping the trucks operational. They worked in makeshift repair facilities, often just cleared areas beside roads, with limited tools and equipment. They cannibalized broken trucks for parts to keep others running. They improvised solutions to mechanical problems that would have stumped better-equipped civilian mechanics. A typical maintenance crew could rebuild an engine in 6 hours, working under tarps in pouring rain because the truck was needed back on the road immediately. Corporal Samuel "Wrench" Jackson ran one of these mobile maintenance teams, traveling the Red Ball Express routes in a specially equipped repair truck. Wrench had worked as an auto mechanic in Detroit before the war, where he'd learned to diagnose problems by sound and feel. He could hear a failing bearing from 50 yards away, could identify a misfiring cylinder just by listening to the engine idle. His diagnostic skills saved countless hours that would have been wasted on trial-and-error repairs. Wrench's crew consisted of 5 men, each specializing in different aspects of truck maintenance. Private Marcus Henderson handled electrical systems, tracing short circuits, and repairing wiring harnesses with steady hands and infinite patience. Corporal David Lee specialized in brake systems, a critical specialty given the constant brake failures on heavily loaded trucks navigating hilly terrain. Private First Class William Foster worked on fuel systems, cleaning carburetors and fuel pumps clogged by the impure gasoline that sometimes made it into supply stocks. Private Robert "Tiny" Johnson, who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 240 pounds, handled the heavy work of engine removal and installation, tasks that normally required multiple men or specialized equipment. Together, Wrench's crew maintained an average of 15 trucks per day, performing everything from minor adjustments to complete engine replacements. They worked 18-hour shifts, grabbing sleep in short intervals while waiting for parts or between repair jobs. Their mobile workshop became a familiar sight along the Red Ball Express routes, the repair truck surrounded by broken vehicles in various states of disassembly, tools scattered everywhere, men covered in grease and oil working frantically to get trucks back operational. The supply chain supporting the Red Ball Express represented a logistical challenge within a logistical challenge. The trucks consumed enormous quantities of fuel, tires, oil, spare parts, and maintenance supplies. Keeping the supply trucks supplied required its own network of support vehicles and warehouses. Every gallon of gasoline delivered to frontline units required that approximately 1 additional gallon be consumed by the trucks doing the delivering. The mathematics of long-distance truck logistics worked against efficiency, with more resources devoted to moving supplies than actually reached the fighting forces. Food for the drivers presented another constant challenge. The men needed substantial calories to sustain them through the grueling work, but field kitchens couldn't keep up with the dispersed, mobile nature of the operation. Drivers relied heavily on ration boxes, those cardboard cartons containing preserved foods designed to provide adequate nutrition in compact, shelf-stable form. The rations were universally despised, their contents varying but consistently disappointing. Private Tommy Wright once joked that the rations were designed to make soldiers look forward to getting shot at, because at least combat provided a distraction from the awful food. His comment drew laughs from other drivers, but it also reflected genuine frustration with the monotonous, unappetizing meals that constituted their primary sustenance for months. Some rations contained processed cheese that had the texture of plastic and tasted like salted cardboard. The meat products, whether supposed to be beef or pork or mystery meat, all had the same grey colour and vaguely disturbing smell. Crackers arrived already stale, chocolate bars melted in the summer heat, then hardened into waxy lumps that barely resembled candy. Drivers developed elaborate trading networks, swapping components from their rations to assemble meals that were at least marginally more interesting. Someone who didn't mind the cheese would trade it for extra crackers. The few rations that included fruit cocktail became valuable currency, traded for multiple other components. Some entrepreneurial soldiers established relationships with French civilians, trading American cigarettes or coffee for fresh bread, eggs or vegetables. These trades violated regulations, but occurred constantly, tolerated by officers who understood their men needed morale boosts that regulations couldn't provide. The relationship between Red Ball Express drivers and French civilians evolved throughout the operation. Initial encounters were often awkward, with language barriers and mutual unfamiliarity creating distance. Many French people had never seen black Americans before. Their understanding of America, shaped by movies that rarely portrayed black citizens, and certainly never showed them in positions of responsibility or operating complex equipment. Some French civilians expressed surprise at seeing black soldiers driving the massive supply convoys. Others seemed indifferent to skin color, focused instead on the fact that these Americans, whatever their background, were delivering the supplies that would drive German forces from French soil. A few older French people compared the black American soldiers favorably to colonial troops they'd encountered from France's African territories, noting that the Americans seemed better equipped, better trained, and treated with more respect by their white officers than colonial soldiers typically received from French commanders. Children in French villages loved the American trucks, running alongside them when convoys passed through towns, waving and calling out the few English words they knew. Drivers tossed candy and chewing gum to the kids when possible, small gestures that created moments of happiness in war-damaged communities. Some drivers carried photographs showing French children's excitement, treasured reminders that their exhausting work made a tangible difference in people's lives. Women in French villages sometimes did laundry for American soldiers, trading this service for soap, food, or other supplies that remained scarce in liberated but damaged communities. These interactions created human connections that transcended race, nationality, and language barriers. A French woman washing a black American soldier's uniform didn't care about segregation policies or racial attitudes back in Alabama or Mississippi. She cared about feeding her family. And if this polite young man with the tired smile could provide soap and coffee in exchange for laundry services, that was a beneficial arrangement for everyone. The Red Ball Express routes became temporary communities, with regular drivers recognizing each other on the road, developing informal communication networks that spread information faster than official channels. If a bridge was damaged, word spread through driver networks before official notices reached everyone. If a particular stretch of road had developed dangerous potholes, drivers warned each other. If MPs at a certain checkpoint were being difficult about paperwork, that information circulated quickly, allowing drivers to prepare proper documentation before reaching the checkpoint. This informal network also tracked which maintenance crews were most reliable, which supply depots had the shortest wait times, and which officers were reasonable versus those who enforced every regulation regardless of circumstances. The knowledge accumulated and shared among drivers represented a form of practical wisdom that no official manual could capture. The lived experience of men navigating a complex system under difficult conditions. Sergeant Dawson became a central node in this informal network after his reverse convoy achievement. Other drivers sought his advice on difficult driving situations, asked his opinion on truck handling techniques, and generally treated him as a master craftsman whose expertise deserved respect. Jimmy never sought this status, but he didn't refuse it either. He understood that sharing knowledge improved everyone's performance and safety. If his backing techniques could help another driver extract themselves from a difficult situation, teaching those techniques served the broader mission. He developed a reputation as someone who would stop to help when he saw another driver struggling, even when it meant delaying his own schedule. Other drivers reciprocated, creating a culture of mutual assistance that strengthened the entire operation. This mutual support extended across the racial lines that segregated the military, with white drivers from other units seeking advice from black Red Bull Express drivers when they encountered mechanical problems or difficult road conditions. Competence commanded respect, even when official policies mandated separation. The 397th Quartermaster Truck Company's complete operational records survived the war, providing historians with detailed documentation of the unit's activities. Those records show consistent excellence across all metrics, lower accident rates than comparable units, higher on-time delivery percentages, and better vehicle maintenance records. The unit's performance reflected leadership quality, soldier dedication, and the pride of men who knew they were representing their race as much as their country. They couldn't afford mediocrity when every failure would be attributed to their skin color rather than individual circumstance. This pressure to constantly prove worth, to exceed rather than merely meet standards, represented one of the profound injustices of segregation. White soldiers could perform adequately without their entire race being judged by their actions. Black soldiers carried representative burden whether they wanted it or not. Jimmy Dawson's exceptional reverse driving solved an immediate logistical problem, but it also served as another data point in the ongoing argument that black Americans deserved equal treatment. The gradual recognition of Red Bull Express contributions paralleled broader acknowledgement of black military service across American history. From the Revolutionary War through Vietnam, African Americans had served in every American conflict, often in segregated units, frequently in support roles, consistently proving competence while facing discrimination. The Red Bull Express represented both continuation of this pattern and beginning of its end. The undeniable success of black units in World War II made continuing segregation increasingly indefensible, leading to post-war integration that transformed the military into one of America's most successfully integrated institutions. By the time Jimmy Dawson passed away in 1999, at age 78, the world had changed dramatically from the one he'd grown up in. The military was fully integrated. Black officers commanded major units. The idea that African Americans couldn't handle complex logistics or technical operations seemed absurdly outdated. Jimmy lived to see these changes, witnessed the civil rights movement's victories, and experienced the satisfaction of knowing his generation's service had mattered. His funeral in Tuscaloosa drew veterans from across the country, black and white men who'd served in the Red Bull Express or heard stories about the legendary reverse convoy. They came to honor a man who'd shown remarkable skill under pressure, who'd solved an impossible problem through creativity and determination, and who'd served his country with distinction despite that country's imperfect acceptance of him. The hauling company Jimmy built still operates today, run by his grandchildren who never personally experienced the segregation their grandfather endured. They know his story, understand its significance, and maintain the standards of excellence he established. The company's conference room displays Jimmy's Bronze Star, photographs from his military service, and a framed copy of Lieutenant Cole's commendation report. It serves as a reminder that their business was built on foundation of skill, integrity, and determination to succeed regardless of obstacles. The actual stretch of French road where Jimmy led his reverse convoy has long since been modernized, widened, and paved with contemporary materials. Nothing marks the location of his achievement, except perhaps the memories of elderly French civilians who might recall the endless stream of American trucks that rolled through their countryside in 1944. The bridge still stands, reinforced and improved but recognizable. The hills remain, though trees have grown and the switchback curves have been gentled by modern engineering. If you traveled that route today, you'd see ordinary French countryside, peaceful and prosperous, bearing few scars from the conflict that swept across it 70-plus years ago. You'd pass in minutes through terrain that took the Red Ball Express hours to traverse. You'd likely give no thought to the thousands of exhausted drivers who made that journey again and again, or to one particular August afternoon, when a sergeant from Alabama backed a gasoline-laden truck 3 miles through impossible circumstances because the mission demanded it and he had the skill to deliver. The weather conditions drivers faced added another layer of difficulty to an already challenging operation. Late summer in northern France could bring sudden rainstorms that turned dusty roads into muddy quagmires within minutes. Trucks that had been making steady progress would suddenly bog down, their wheels spinning uselessly in the slick mud. Drivers learned to carry wooden planks, metal tracks, and chains for extracting stuck vehicles, but these tools only helped so much when a 5-ton truck sank hub-deep in mud. Rain also reduced visibility, making the already dangerous convoy driving even more hazardous. Windshield wipers on military trucks were notoriously inadequate, barely clearing enough glass for drivers to see the road ahead. At night during rainstorms, drivers navigated almost blind, relying on instinct and memory of routes they'd traveled dozens of times. The mandatory convoy spacing often collapsed during storms, with drivers closing up on the vehicle ahead just to maintain visual contact with its barely visible taillights. Fog presented different but equally serious challenges. Dense morning fog could blanket entire valleys, reducing visibility to less than 50 feet. Convoys would grind to a crawl or stop completely, waiting for the fog to lift enough to safely proceed. But schedules didn't allow for weather delays. Officers faced constant pressure to keep trucks moving, leading to impossible decisions about acceptable risk levels. Proceeding in dangerous conditions risked accidents. Stopping risked missing critical delivery windows. There were no good choices, only different varieties of calculated risk. The summer heat created its own set of problems. Truck cabs had no air conditioning, just small windows that provided minimal ventilation. On hot days, cab temperatures could exceed 110 degrees, turning the driving compartments into ovens that baked the men inside. Drivers developed techniques for staying functional in the heat, soaking bandanas in water and wearing them around their necks, drinking enormous quantities of water when it was available, and taking turns pouring water over their heads at rest stops. Dehydration was a constant concern. Medical personnel attached to the quartermaster units treated numerous cases of heat exhaustion and heat stroke during the hottest weeks of August and early September. Some drivers simply collapsed after completing their runs, their bodies unable to cope with the cumulative effects of heat, exhaustion, and dehydration. The military medical system had to develop rapid treatment protocols for heat casualties, learning through experience how to quickly cool overheated soldiers and rehydrate them efficiently. Sleep deprivation affected everyone. The operation's 24-hour nature meant drivers worked in rotating shifts that constantly disrupted natural sleep rhythms. A driver might work from 0400 to 2000 one day, sleep for 6 hours, then start another run at 0200. The irregular schedule made quality sleep nearly impossible. Men learned to sleep whenever and wherever they could, grabbing 30-minute naps during loading delays, dozing at rest stops, sleeping in their truck cabs between runs. The cumulative effects of chronic sleep deprivation showed in increased accident rates, slower reaction times, and deteriorating judgment. Drivers would sometimes fall asleep at the wheel for brief moments, snapping awake when their truck drifted off the road, or the assistant driver shouted a warning. Some accidents resulted from nothing more than a driver's exhausted brain shutting down for a few critical seconds. The military understood the problem, but had no solution. The supplies had to move, the drivers available were finite, and the only way to sustain the operation was to accept that men would be pushed beyond normal human limits. Coffee became the universal solution, consumed in quantities that would horrify civilian doctors. The military provided instant coffee in ration packages, and drivers brewed it strong enough that the resulting liquid was barely drinkable, but delivered the caffeine jolt they desperately needed. Some drivers supplemented with Benzedrine tablets, a brand name for amphetamine, that military medicine dispensed liberally to help soldiers stay awake during critical operations. The long-term health implications of this chemical wakefulness were unknown and frankly irrelevant. Survival demanded staying alert, and Benzedrine delivered alertness, even if it came with jitters, anxiety, and the crash that followed when the drug wore off. The psychological toll of the endless driving affected men in different ways. Some drivers became increasingly withdrawn, focusing entirely on the immediate task of operating their truck while mentally disconnecting from everything else. They'd complete their runs in silence, speaking only when necessary, conserving emotional energy for the driving itself. Others became almost manic, filling every moment with conversation, jokes, or singing, using constant activity to avoid confronting their exhaustion and stress. Religious faith sustained many drivers through the grinding routine. Some men prayed before each run, seeking divine protection for the dangerous journey ahead. Others found comfort in small religious items, carrying Bibles, rosaries, or prayer cards that connected them to spiritual traditions that had sustained their families through generations of hardship. The chaplains assigned to quartermaster units held services whenever possible, and attendance was typically strong despite the exhausting schedule. For men pushed to their limits, faith offered hope that extended beyond the immediate circumstances of military service. Letters from home provided another crucial source of emotional sustenance. Mail delivery to mobile units was irregular at best, but when letters arrived, they were treasured. Men read and reread messages from mothers, wives, girlfriends, siblings, and children, maintaining emotional connections to the lives and identities they'd left behind. Writing letters also provided an outlet, allowing drivers to process their experiences by putting them into words, even if they carefully censored content to avoid worrying families or running afoul of military censorship. The reality of segregation continued to impact black soldiers even in the relatively integrated environment of active operations. While Red Ball Express drivers worked alongside white soldiers from other units and generally received respect for their competence, returning to rear areas meant returning to segregated facilities. Mess halls, barracks, recreation areas, and even medical facilities often remained separated by race. Black soldiers who just completed grueling runs that were keeping the Allied advance moving would then be directed to inferior facilities because of their skin color. These contradictions didn't escape anyone's notice. Black drivers particularly resented being treated as essential professionals on the road, but second-class citizens off duty. Some simply avoided rear area facilities as much as possible, preferring to sleep in their trucks and eat cold rations rather than submit to the indignity of segregated amenities. Others complied with segregation policies while silently resolving that they wouldn't tolerate such treatment after returning home. The wartime experience, where their capabilities were undeniable and their contributions critical, planted seeds of expectations for better treatment that would fuel post-war civil rights activism. White officers who commanded black units had to navigate these contradictions daily. Some, like Lieutenant Cole and Captain Henderson, grew to genuinely respect and advocate for their men, recognizing the injustice of policies that limited soldiers based on skin color rather than ability. These officers wrote reports and recommendations supporting better treatment, equal opportunities, and eventual integration. Their advocacy often cost them socially, as other white officers sometimes viewed them as troublemakers or worse for defending black soldiers' dignity and rights. Other white officers simply enforced existing policies without question, neither particularly cruel nor particularly sympathetic, just following regulations and doing their jobs. A few actively embraced racist attitudes, treating their black soldiers with contempt, even while depending on those same men to accomplish critical missions. These officers created unnecessary hardship through petty enforcement of discriminatory rules, casual insults, and general disrespect that damaged unit cohesion and morale. The significance of Jimmy Dawson's accomplishment extended beyond the immediate logistics crisis he solved. His story represented the larger narrative of African-American military service, the pattern of black soldiers proving themselves exceptional to be treated as merely adequate, demonstrating capabilities that racism insisted they couldn't possess. Every successful Red Ball Express delivery, every on-time arrival, every safely completed mission served as evidence against the segregation system that confined these soldiers to support roles. The irony wasn't lost on the men who served. They hauled ammunition they weren't trusted to fire, delivered supplies they weren't assigned to use, and kept armies moving forward while restricted to rear echelon positions. Yet they took pride in their work, understood its importance, and performed with excellence that eventually forced acknowledgement. The backward-driving convoy became symbolic of this larger reality, a black sergeant leading the way by going in reverse, finding solutions others couldn't imagine, succeeding in tasks others declared impossible. Military integration following World War II happened gradually, unevenly, resisted in some quarters and embraced in others. But it happened, driven partly by practical recognition that segregation wasted talent and complicated operations. Officers who'd commanded or worked with black units during the war, men like Captain Henderson and Captain Cole, often supported integration based on direct experience contradicting racial assumptions. Their testimony carried weight with military leadership, trying to assess integration's practical feasibility. The complete success of military integration, achieved decades before comparable progress in civilian society, proved the effectiveness of clear standards fairly applied. The military demanded competence, provided training to achieve it, and evaluated performance through objective metrics. When those standards were genuinely enforced regardless of race, black and white soldiers succeeded or failed based on ability rather than prejudice. This lesson, learned slowly in the military context, offered a model for broader social integration that America would take much longer to implement. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.